My boss's wife, Victoria, slapped me across the face at the annual company party after calling me a pathetic nobody who would never amount to anything. What she didn't know was that I owned the entire luxury apartment complex where she lived, and her lease was up for renewal next month. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom cast elegant shadows across the marble floor, but nothing could illuminate the darkness that was about to consume Victoria Blackwood's perfectly curated life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood perfectly still near the champagne fountain, my cheeks still stinging from the force of her manicured hand, watching Victoria smooth down her designer gown, as if striking an employee was just another social nicety to be managed with grace. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken only by the soft murmur of shocked conversations from the other guests who had witnessed what would soon become the most expensive slap in the history of Blackwood and Associates marketing. My name is Elena Vasquez, and until that moment, everyone at the party knew me as the quiet financial analyst who processed expense reports and managed budget spreadsheets from a cramped cubicle on the third floor. What they didn't know was that the reserved young woman they barely noticed had been systematically acquiring real estate properties across the city for the past 5 years, building an empire that now included some of the most prestigious residential buildings in the metropolitan area. The Avalon Towers, where Victoria Blackwood lived in a penthouse apartment that cost more per month than most people earned in a year, was my latest and most valuable acquisition. The previous owner, an elderly real estate mogul named Harrison Webb, had been looking for a buyer who would maintain the building's exclusive character while modernizing its operations. When I approached him through my investment company, Meridian Holdings, he had been impressed by my detailed renovation plans and commitment to preserving the property's luxury status. Victoria had no idea that her monthly rent checks, written with such casual arrogance as she complained about the building's minor imperfections, were actually being deposited into accounts controlled by the same woman she treated like an insignificant office drone. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted, though I had certainly never planned for our paths to intersect in such a dramatic fashion. The company party was supposed to be a celebration of Blackwood and Associates' most successful quarter in company history. Regional marketing campaigns had exceeded projections, client retention rates had reached record highs, and the firm's reputation for innovative advertising strategies had attracted several high-profile new accounts. As someone who managed the financial data behind these successes, I knew better than most how impressive the numbers truly were. I had been standing quietly near the refreshment area, observing the social dynamics that played out at these corporate gatherings, when Victoria Blackwood made her entrance. She swept into the ballroom wearing a gown that probably cost more than my official annual salary, her platinum blonde hair styled in an elaborate updo that showcased diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement. Her husband, Richard Blackwood, followed a few steps behind, his attention already captured by potential clients and business partners who wanted to discuss expansion opportunities. Victoria possessed the kind of commanding presence that immediately drew attention wherever she went. At 42, she had maintained the striking beauty that had initially caught Richard's eye when they met at a charity gala 15 years earlier. But beneath the polished exterior lay a personality that had grown increasingly entitled and cruel, as her husband's business success had elevated their social status. I had been observing Victoria's behavior at company events for the past 3 years, noting how she treated different categories of people with varying degrees of respect, based on their perceived value to her social aspirations. Senior executives and their spouses received warm smiles and animated conversation. Mid-level managers earned polite acknowledgement and brief pleasantries. Support staff like myself were generally invisible to her, warranting neither recognition nor basic courtesy. The pattern had become so predictable that I found myself studying it with the same analytical attention I applied to financial data. Victoria Blackwood was a woman who measured every interaction in terms of potential social advancement or networking opportunities, and anyone who couldn't contribute to her status was simply irrelevant to her carefully constructed world. Tonight, however, something had shifted in the usual dynamic. Perhaps it was the influence of the champagne she had been consuming since her arrival, or maybe the stress of maintaining her social position in an increasingly competitive environment had finally taken its toll. Whatever the catalyst, Victoria was about to reveal a side of her personality that would fundamentally change both of our lives. The confrontation began innocuously enough. I had been reviewing some quarterly reports on my phone, standing in a quiet corner near the dessert table, when Victoria approached with two other wives from the executive circle. Margaret Thornton, married to the company's creative director, and Susan Walsh, whose husband headed the digital marketing division, flanked Victoria like supporting actresses in a carefully choreographed performance. "Well, well," Victoria said, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "If it isn't our little numbers girl, hiding in the corner as usual. Elena, isn't it? Still crunching those spreadsheets and living that exciting cubicle life?" I looked up from my phone, offering the polite smile that I had perfected for these awkward social interactions. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood. I hope you're enjoying the party." Margaret and Susan exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension that was building beneath Victoria's seemingly casual conversation. Both women had witnessed Victoria's treatment of employees before, and recognized the signs of an impending confrontation. "Oh, I'm having a wonderful time," Victoria replied, taking a step closer to me with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her behavior. "Though I have to say, it's fascinating to watch how some people spend their time at these events. Most of us are here networking, building relationships, discussing opportunities for growth and advancement. But you seem content to stand alone, scrolling through your little phone like you're still at work." The observation stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely hurtful. I did tend to keep to myself at company social events, partly because of my naturally reserved personality, but mostly because I had learned that my colleagues' interest in conversation rarely extended beyond polite small talk about weather and weekend plans. The real reason I attended these gatherings was to observe the social dynamics and business relationships that influenced the company's operations, information that proved valuable in my financial analysis work. "I find these events interesting to observe," I replied carefully, unwilling to give Victoria the emotional reaction she seemed to be seeking. "There's always a lot happening beneath the surface." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Observe? How perfectly appropriate for someone in your position. Always watching from the sidelines, never actually participating in anything meaningful. Tell me, Elena, do you ever have ambitions beyond processing expense reports and updating budget spreadsheets?" Margaret Thornton shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that Victoria was crossing lines of professional courtesy that should have remained intact even at social gatherings. "Victoria, perhaps we—"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"Should. No, I'm genuinely curious," Victoria interrupted, her voice gaining volume as champagne lowered her inhibitions further. "I mean, here we are, surrounded by successful people who have built careers, established themselves in positions of influence, created something meaningful with their lives. And then we have Elena, content to remain invisible in her little cubicle, processing other people's achievements without ever attempting to achieve anything herself." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to reinforce what Victoria clearly viewed as an insurmountable hierarchy between us. In her mind, I was exactly what I appeared to be, a lower-level employee whose greatest aspiration was maintaining steady employment in a position that required minimal creativity or ambition. "Success can take many different forms," I said quietly, maintaining my composure despite the growing audience that Victoria's raised voice was attracting. "Not everyone defines achievement the same way." "Oh, how diplomatic," Victoria sneered. "That's exactly the kind of thing unsuccessful people say, to make themselves feel better about their limitations. Success isn't subjective, Elena. It's measurable. It's visible. It's about building something that matters, creating value that other people recognize and respect." Susan Walsh was now actively trying to catch Victoria's attention, gesturing subtly toward the growing circle of colleagues who had stopped their own conversations to watch the increasingly uncomfortable exchange. But Victoria was too committed to her performance to recognize the warning signs. "Look around this room," Victoria continued, spreading her arms wide to encompass the elegant ballroom filled with successful professionals. Every person here has accomplished something meaningful with their lives. They've built businesses, managed teams, created campaigns that influence thousands of consumers, established themselves as leaders in their fields. What have you built, Elena? What have you created that anyone would notice if it disappeared tomorrow? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching to see how I would respond. Victoria had positioned this as a moment of truth, a confrontation between success and mediocrity that would confirm everyone's assumptions about social hierarchies and personal worth. What Victoria didn't know was that she had just asked exactly the right question to expose the complete inversion of our actual circumstances. While she had been building a lifestyle supported entirely by her husband's achievements, I had been quietly constructing a real estate empire that generated more monthly income than Richard Blackwood's entire marketing firm. The Avalon Towers alone, where Victoria lived in oblivious luxury, was worth $47 million. The building generated $2.8 million annually in rental income, not including the additional revenue from parking fees, storage units, and premium services that I had implemented since acquiring the property. Victoria's penthouse rent of $18,000 per month represented less than 8% of the building's total monthly income, though it was still enough to cover the mortgage payments on 2 of my smaller properties. But the Avalon Towers was just one piece of a portfolio that included 17 other residential buildings, ranging from converted loft apartments in the Arts District to luxury condominiums near the waterfront. Meridian Holdings had become one of the city's most successful property management companies, though I maintained such a low profile that few people in the real estate community could have identified me by name. The anonymity was deliberate. Operating through shell companies and property management firms allowed me to acquire buildings without triggering the kind of attention that might have complicated my day job at Blackwood & Associates. My colleagues knew me as Elena Vasquez, the quiet financial analyst who lived modestly and kept to herself. They had no reason to suspect that the same person controlled rental properties that housed some of the city's most influential residents. I suppose I haven't built anything that would be obvious to casual observation, I replied to Victoria's challenge, maintaining the humble demeanor that had served me well for so many years. Some achievements are more visible than others. Victoria's smile was triumphant, clearly interpreting my response as an admission of defeat. Exactly my point. Some people are builders, Elena, and others are just supporters. There's nothing wrong with knowing your place in the world, as long as you're honest about what that place actually is. Margaret Thornton was now actively tugging on Victoria's arm, trying to extract her from a conversation that had spiraled far beyond the bounds of appropriate social interaction. Victoria, I think we should rejoin our husbands. They're probably wondering where we've disappeared to. But Victoria was too intoxicated by her own perceived victory to recognize that she needed rescue. In just a moment, Margaret. I'm providing Elena with some valuable life coaching here. Sometimes people need to hear hard truths about their limitations before they can make peace with their circumstances. The condescension in her voice was so thick that I could see other guests actively cringing with secondhand embarrassment. Victoria had crossed every line of professional courtesy and basic human decency, but she was too invested in her performance to realize that her behavior was reflecting poorly on her, rather than establishing her superiority. You see, Elena, Victoria continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining complex concepts to a child. The sooner you accept that some people are meant to lead, and others are meant to follow, the happier you'll be. There's dignity in knowing your role, and playing it well, even if that role is essentially invisible to the people who matter. The phrase people who matter was delivered with such casual cruelty that I felt something shift inside me. Victoria wasn't just being rude or inappropriate, she was systematically attempting to destroy my sense of self-worth in front of an audience of my colleagues. This wasn't social awkwardness or poor judgment influenced by alcohol. This was deliberate humiliation designed to reinforce her perceived position in a hierarchy that existed only in her own mind. Some of us are destined for penthouse apartments and designer gowns, Victoria said, gesturing to her own elegant attire. while others are meant for cubicles and clearance rack clothing. The key is accepting these natural divisions rather than harboring unrealistic fantasies about rising above your station. The reference to penthouse apartments was so perfectly ironic that I almost smiled. Victoria was using her residence in my building as evidence of her superiority over the woman who actually owned that residence. She was literally paying me rent while explaining why I would never achieve the kind of success that her lifestyle represented. "I appreciate the perspective," I said carefully, aware that anything I said would be scrutinized by the growing audience surrounding us. Though I've found that appearances can sometimes be deceiving. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, Elena, that's exactly the kind of self-deluding thinking that keeps people trapped in mediocrity. Appearances matter because they reflect reality. Success is visible. Achievement creates status symbols that other people can recognize and respect. When you live in a luxury building, drive an expensive car, wear designer clothing, those things communicate your value to the world." Each item on Victoria's list represented something that I could afford far more easily than she could, though my preference for financial discretion meant that I chose not to display wealth in such obvious ways. The luxury building she referenced was mine. The expensive car she drove was financed through payments that strained even Richard's substantial income. The designer clothing came from shopping trips that frequently required credit card debt to finance. Victoria's lifestyle was an elaborate performance, designed to create the impression of wealth and success, but the financial reality behind that performance was far more precarious than anyone realized. Richard Blackwood earned a substantial salary as the head of a successful marketing firm, but maintaining Victoria's social aspirations required spending that consistently exceeded their actual income. I knew this because managing the financial operations at Blackwood & Associates gave me insight into executive compensation packages, and I had also conducted thorough background checks on all the tenants in my buildings. Victoria and Richard's application for the Avalon Towers penthouse had required extensive financial documentation, including tax returns, bank statements, and credit reports that painted a detailed picture of their economic circumstances. The truth was that Victoria's penthouse rent represented nearly 40% of Richard's monthly income, a ratio that any financial advisor would consider dangerously high. They were maintaining their lifestyle through a combination of credit card debt, home equity loans, and financial assistance from Richard's parents, creating a house of cards that could collapse if any single element shifted unexpectedly. But Victoria's financial vulnerabilities were irrelevant to the current situation. What mattered was that she had chosen to publicly humiliate me at a professional gathering, crossing lines that would have consequences far beyond anything she could imagine. "You know what I find most sad about people like you, Elena?" Victoria continued, apparently determined to push this confrontation to its absolute breaking point. "It's not just that you lack ambition or achievement. It's that you seem to have convinced yourself that modest aspirations are somehow virtuous. As if choosing mediocrity is a moral position rather than just an admission of inadequacy." The psychological cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. Victoria wasn't content with simply asserting her superiority. She was attempting to reframe my entire approach to life as a character flaw that deserved moral judgment. In her mind, anyone who didn't pursue visible wealth and status was fundamentally defective, worthy of both pity and contempt. "I've always believed that people should pursue what brings them satisfaction," I replied, maintaining my composure through sheer force of will. "Different individuals find fulfillment in different types of achievements." "Satisfaction," Victoria repeated the word like it tasted bitter. How wonderfully philosophical. But you know what's interesting about satisfaction, Elena? Truly successful people don't need to rationalize their circumstances by claiming they're satisfied with less. They're actually achieving things that matter, building lives that other people admire and respect. Susan Walsh had given up on subtle intervention and was now directly attempting to physically remove Victoria from the conversation. "Victoria, Richard is looking for you. I think he needs to introduce you to some potential clients." But Victoria shrugged off the interruption with growing irritation. "Richard can handle his business networking perfectly well without my assistance. I'm having an educational conversation here." Sometimes it's important to help people understand the difference between genuine achievement and self-deluding compromise. The word educational triggered a memory of the original story I had analyzed, though the context here was completely different. Victoria was positioning herself as a teacher delivering hard truths to someone who needed enlightenment about reality. She had no idea that she was about to receive an education that would shatter every assumption she had made about power, success, and social hierarchies. "Elena," Victoria said, her voice taking on the false kindness of someone delivering what they believed was helpful criticism. "I want you to understand that I'm not being cruel here. I'm actually trying to help you develop realistic expectations about your life trajectory. Some people are meant to observe from the sidelines, and there's dignity in accepting that role rather than entertaining fantasies about joining the game." The metaphor of watching from the sidelines versus participating in the game was revealing because it exposed how Victoria understood social and professional dynamics. In her mind, life was a competitive arena where some people earned the right to be players, while others were relegated to audience status. She saw herself as someone who had earned a position on the field, while I was naturally suited for the bleachers. What Victoria couldn't comprehend was that I had been playing an entirely different game for the past 5 years, operating on a level that made her social positioning seem like child's play in comparison. While she had been focused on maintaining appearances and social status, I had been building actual wealth and genuine influence through strategic real estate investments and careful business development. The buildings I owned generated passive income that exceeded what most people earned through active employment. The tenants who paid me rent included doctors, lawyers, executives, and entrepreneurs who would have been shocked to discover that their reserved landlord was a woman they would have dismissed as socially irrelevant. Victoria herself was unknowingly funding my investment activities through the rent payments she made with such casual entitlement. But the financial dynamics were only part of the story. The real power I had cultivated lay in the discretion to operate invisibly while controlling elements of other people's lives in ways they never recognized. Every lease renewal, every maintenance decision, every policy change in my buildings affected residents who had no idea who was making those choices or why. Victoria lived in my penthouse apartment because I had decided to approve her application despite financial documentation that suggested she was overextending herself. I could have rejected her tenancy based on debt-to-income ratios that exceeded my normal standards, but I had been curious to observe how someone with her spending patterns would manage the financial pressure of luxury living. The decision to accept Victoria as a tenant had provided me with ongoing insight into the lifestyle choices and financial management strategies of someone who prioritized image over sustainability. Her monthly rent payments were consistently late, usually arriving with fees that she paid without complaint rather than addressing the underlying budgeting issues that created the delays. But tonight's confrontation had shifted my perspective on Victoria from curious observation to active dislike. Her willingness to publicly humiliate someone she perceived as powerless revealed a character flaw that went far beyond poor financial management or social pretension. This was deliberate cruelty, designed to reinforce hierarchies that existed primarily in her own imagination. "I think what Elena needs to understand," Victoria continued, apparently addressing Margaret and Susan rather than speaking to me directly, "is that success requires taking risks, making investments, putting yourself in positions where failure is possible but achievement is rewarded. People who hide in cubicles and avoid challenges never develop the skills or experience necessary for real advancement." The irony of receiving a lecture about risk-taking and investment from someone who was living beyond her means while paying rent to fund my actual investment activities was almost overwhelming. Victoria was explaining principles of wealth building to the person who was literally profiting from her mismanagement of those same principles. "Some people are natural entrepreneurs," Victoria declared, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her theme. "They see opportunities, they take calculated risks, they build something meaningful from nothing. Others are followers who need the security of steady employment and predictable routines. There's nothing shameful about being a follower, Elena, as long as you don't pretend to be something you're not." The word entrepreneur was particularly galling. Because Victoria had never demonstrated any entrepreneurial instincts beyond spending money she didn't have on lifestyle accessories that created the illusion of success. Her only business experience consisted of organizing charity events and social gatherings that served primarily to enhance her own social positioning rather than creating value for other people. Meanwhile, I had built Meridian Holdings from nothing, starting with a small duplex that I purchased with savings from my first 2 years at Blackwood & Associates. The initial investment had been modest, but careful research and strategic improvements had allowed me to sell that property for a substantial profit within 18 months. I had reinvested those gains into a larger apartment building, then used the rental income from that property to finance additional acquisitions. Each purchase had been preceded by months of market analysis, financial modeling, and due diligence that would have impressed any professional real estate investor. I had educated myself about zoning laws, construction regulations, tax implications, and property management best practices through evening classes and weekend seminars while maintaining my day job at the marketing firm. The portfolio I had assembled represented genuine entrepreneurial achievement built through systematic risk-taking, strategic planning, and careful execution. Victoria's lifestyle was funded through credit and financial assistance, while mine was supported by assets that generated passive income and appreciated in value over time. But pointing out these facts would have required revealing information that I preferred to keep private, at least until I was ready to transition away from my day job at Blackwood & Associates. The anonymity that allowed me to operate invisibly in the real estate market also meant that I had to endure social situations like this one without defending myself using the truth. "Victoria," Margaret Thornton said with increasing urgency, "I really think we should rejoin the other guests. This conversation seems to have gotten a bit intense." Victoria waved off the suggestion with growing irritation. "Margaret, I'm providing Elena with valuable mentorship here. Sometimes people need to hear difficult truths about their limitations before they can make realistic plans for their futures." The word mentorship was particularly offensive because it implied that Victoria possessed knowledge or experience that qualified her to provide guidance about professional development or life strategy. Her understanding of business was limited to spending other people's money and maintaining social connections that served primarily decorative functions. "I appreciate your concern for my future," I said carefully, aware that anything I said would be analyzed by the growing audience surrounding us. Though I've found that success often comes in forms that aren't immediately visible to outside observers. Victoria's smile was condescending and triumphant. "Oh, Elena, that's exactly the kind of self-deluding thinking that keeps people trapped in mediocrity. Success isn't invisible. Achievement creates tangible results that other people can recognize and respect. When you build something meaningful, when you accomplish something significant, when you establish yourself as a person of influence, those achievements become apparent to everyone around you." The statement revealed so much about Victoria's understanding of power and influence that I almost felt sorry for her. She genuinely believed that success was primarily about perception and social recognition rather than actual capability or financial achievement. In her mind, the appearance of wealth was more important than its substance, and the ability to command social attention was more valuable than the ability to generate actual results. This worldview explained why Victoria had invested so much energy in maintaining lifestyle accessories that strained her family's finances rather than developing skills or building assets that could generate sustainable wealth. She was playing a game where the goal was to look successful rather than to actually become successful, and she had convinced herself that anyone who didn't prioritize appearances was simply too limited to understand the rules. "You know what separates truly successful people from everyone else, Elena?" Victoria asked, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone delivering profound wisdom. "It's the courage to claim their place in the world rather than accepting whatever scraps other people offer them. It's the confidence to demand respect rather than hoping someone might notice their quiet contributions." The reference to claiming one's place in the world was ironic beyond anything Victoria could imagine. While she had been focused on demanding social respect through lifestyle displays, I had been quietly claiming actual ownership of valuable real estate properties throughout the metropolitan area. The confidence she was lecturing me about was exactly what had enabled me to make million-dollar investment decisions while maintaining a humble profile that allowed me to observe social dynamics without becoming entangled in them. But Victoria's misunderstanding of my circumstances was about to become far more expensive than she could possibly anticipate. The lease for her penthouse apartment at Avalon Towers was scheduled for renewal next month, and the conversation we were having would definitely influence my decisions about rental terms and tenant relations. I think confidence manifests in different ways for different people, I replied, maintaining my diplomatic tone despite Victoria's increasingly aggressive behavior. Some achievements speak louder than others. Victoria laughed with genuine amusement, clearly interpreting my response as further evidence of the delusional thinking she had been diagnosing. Achievement that speaks quietly is just a polite way of describing failure, Elena. Real success makes noise. It demands attention. It forces other people to acknowledge your value, whether they want to or not. The philosophy she was articulating explained so much about Victoria's approach to social interactions and lifestyle choices. She genuinely believed that value was determined by other people's recognition, rather than by objective measures of capability or contribution. This mindset had led her to prioritize appearances over substance in every aspect of her life, creating a feedback loop where she became increasingly dependent on external validation to maintain her sense of self-worth. The tragedy was that Victoria's approach was not only unsustainable financially, but it was also ultimately self-defeating psychologically. By measuring her worth through other people's perceptions, she had trapped herself in a constant performance that required ever-increasing displays of wealth and status to maintain credibility. The pressure to keep up with her own image had become a prison that limited her ability to make rational decisions about money, relationships, or personal development. "You see, Elena," Victoria continued, her voice gaining volume as alcohol and self-righteousness combined to eliminate whatever social filters had previously constrained her behavior. "The problem with people like you is that you've confused being overlooked with being humble. You've convinced yourself that invisibility is a virtue, when it's actually just evidence that you haven't done anything worth noticing." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely hurtful, though not in the way Victoria intended. I had deliberately chosen invisibility as a strategy for building wealth without attracting the kind of attention that might have complicated my business operations or my day job. The anonymity that Victoria was criticizing as a character flaw was actually one of my greatest competitive advantages in the real estate market. Operating under the radar allowed me to acquire properties without triggering bidding wars with other investors who might have driven up prices. Maintaining a low profile meant that sellers often underestimated my financial capabilities, leading to negotiations where I could secure favorable terms, without revealing the full extent of my resources. The modest lifestyle I maintained served as camouflage that protected my business interests while allowing me to observe market dynamics without becoming a target for competitors or opportunists. But Victoria's critique was hitting its mark because it exposed an uncomfortable truth about the personal costs of my chosen strategy. While financial success had given me security and independence, the secrecy required to maintain that success had also created a form of social isolation that sometimes felt genuinely lonely. Watching Victoria's confident performance, despite its obvious flaws and underlying desperation, reminded me that there were aspects of human connection and social recognition that my careful anonymity had prevented me from experiencing. "The saddest part," Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of false sympathy that was more cruel than outright hostility, "is that you probably tell yourself that other people just don't understand your special qualities, that if they really knew you, they would appreciate your hidden talents and secret contributions. But the truth is that if you had anything truly valuable to offer, you would have found a way to make it visible by now." The psychological accuracy of Victoria's attack was breathtaking in its cruelty. She had identified the exact insecurity that my chosen lifestyle had created, and was now systematically exploiting it in front of an audience of my professional colleagues. The rational part of my mind knew that her analysis was fundamentally flawed, but the emotional impact of hearing my deepest fears articulated so clearly was devastating nonetheless. Victoria was essentially arguing that my financial success was meaningless because it remained invisible to the people around me, that my carefully constructed real estate empire was worthless because it didn't generate the kind of social recognition that would validate my importance in other people's eyes. She was attacking the very foundation of my approach to building wealth and influence by suggesting that value existed only when it was acknowledged by others. The attack was particularly effective because it targeted the one aspect of my situation that I sometimes questioned myself. There were moments, usually late at night when I was reviewing financial reports in my home office, when I wondered whether the anonymity that protected my business interests was also preventing me from experiencing the full satisfaction of my achievements. Victoria was articulating those doubts with surgical precision, using them as weapons to reinforce her own sense of superiority. "I mean, Elena," Victoria continued, apparently determined to push this confrontation to its absolute breaking point. "You're 31 years old, working in a cubicle, living alone in some modest apartment, with no visible accomplishments, no meaningful relationships, no evidence that your existence has made any positive difference in the world. At what point do you stop telling yourself that you're just misunderstood and start accepting that maybe you're exactly as ordinary as you appear to be?" The age reference was accurate, though I wondered how Victoria had obtained that information since we rarely interacted directly at work. The assumption about my living situation was completely wrong. I owned a converted loft in the arts district that I had renovated to my exact specifications, but correcting her would have required providing details about my personal life that I preferred to keep private. The accusation about lacking meaningful relationships was more painful because it contained a grain of truth. My focus on building wealth and maintaining professional anonymity had definitely limited my social connections and romantic opportunities. It was difficult to develop close relationships when so much of my actual life had to remain secret, and the energy required to manage my real estate portfolio left limited time for the social activities that might have led to deeper personal connections. But the suggestion that my existence had made no positive difference was particularly unfair, because my real estate investments had actually created substantial value for many people. The buildings I owned provided high-quality housing for hundreds of tenants, my renovation projects had revitalized entire neighborhoods, and my property management practices had set new standards for maintenance and tenant services that other landlords had begun adopting. The problem was that these contributions remained invisible to most people because I operated through property management companies and shell corporations that maintained my anonymity. Tenants appreciated the quality of their housing without knowing who was responsible for the strategic decisions that created those positive experiences. Neighborhoods benefited from my investments without recognizing the source of the improvements that enhanced their property values and quality of life. Victoria's attack was effective because it forced me to confront the gap between my actual achievements and my public recognition, between the substantial impact I had created through my business activities and the modest profile I maintained in my social and professional interactions. She was using my chosen invisibility as evidence of my irrelevance, turning my greatest strategic advantage into apparent proof of my failure. "You know what I think, Elena?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the false intimacy of someone sharing confidential insights. "I think you've spent so many years telling yourself that you're different from other people, that you're somehow above the need for recognition or achievement, that you've lost sight of what actual success looks like. You've created this elaborate rationalization for mediocrity that allows you to feel superior to people who are actually building meaningful lives." The accusation was so perfectly inverted from reality that it left me temporarily speechless. Victoria was describing her own psychological pattern while attributing it to me, projecting her dependence on external validation onto someone who had deliberately chosen to build wealth without seeking recognition. She was criticizing me for the exact mindset that actually characterized her own approach to life and social interaction. The elaborate rationalization she described was precisely what Victoria had constructed to justify her unsustainable lifestyle choices. She had convinced herself that appearances were more important than substance, that social recognition was more valuable than financial security, that maintaining an image of success was equivalent to actually achieving success. The superiority complex she attributed to me was exactly what drove her own behavior, the need to feel elevated above people she perceived as her social inferiors. But pointing out these psychological dynamics would have required a level of personal attack that I wasn't comfortable making, even in response to Victoria's systematic attempt to humiliate me. The truth was that I genuinely felt sorry for someone who had become so dependent on external validation that she needed to destroy other people's confidence to maintain her own sense of worth. The audience surrounding our confrontation had grown to include nearly half the party guests, though most were maintaining enough distance to avoid appearing overly interested in what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. I could see Richard Blackwood across the room, engaged in conversation with potential clients, apparently unaware that his wife was systematically destroying her own reputation through a display of cruelty that would be remembered long after the evening ended. "Victoria," Susan Walsh said with desperate urgency, "I really think we need to step away from this conversation. People are starting to stare, and I don't think this is the kind of attention you want at a professional event." But Victoria was too committed to her performance to recognize that she needed rescue. The combination of alcohol and self-righteousness had created a feedback loop where each cruel statement seemed to justify the next, building toward a crescendo that would soon cross every line of appropriate social behavior. "Susan, I'm providing Elena with valuable feedback here," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she was performing a public service. "Sometimes people need to hear difficult truths about their limitations before they can start making realistic choices about their futures. I'm actually being kind by helping her understand why her current approach to life isn't working." The claim of kindness was so divorced from reality that several people in our audience actually winced with secondhand embarrassment. Victoria had convinced herself that systematic humiliation was actually a form of mentorship, that psychological cruelty was justified if it served the supposed goal of helping someone accept their place in the social hierarchy. "Elena," Victoria said, turning back to me with the expression of someone delivering painful but necessary medicine, "I want you to understand that I'm not attacking you personally. I'm simply observing that your approach to life seems designed to avoid the kind of challenges and risks that create genuine achievement. You've chosen safety over significance, comfort over contribution, invisibility over impact." Each paired contrast was carefully chosen to reinforce Victoria's central thesis that I had consciously selected mediocrity over excellence, that my current circumstances represented a deliberate choice to avoid the competition and exposure that success required. She was framing my anonymity as cowardice rather than strategy, my financial discretion as fear rather than wisdom. The accusations were particularly frustrating because they revealed how completely Victoria misunderstood both my actual circumstances and my motivations for maintaining a low profile. Her analysis was based on the assumption that anyone with genuine capabilities would naturally seek public recognition, that success without visibility was essentially meaningless, that value existed only when it was acknowledged by others. What Victoria couldn't comprehend was that some forms of power were most effective when they remained invisible, that certain types of influence grew stronger through discretion rather than display. The real estate empire I had built operated precisely because it stayed beneath the radar of competitors and regulators, who might have interfered with my acquisition strategies if they had understood the scope of my activities. But Victoria's psychological assault was about to cross a line that would transform this from an uncomfortable social situation into something far more consequential. I could see in her expression that she was building toward a climactic statement, some final declaration that would cement her perceived victory in this one-sided confrontation. "The truth is, Elena," Victoria said, her voice rising to ensure that every guest in the immediate area could hear her clearly, "some people are born to lead, and others are destined to follow. Some are meant for penthouse apartments, and others for basement studios. Some command respect through their achievements while others beg for scraps of attention through their neediness." The reference to penthouse apartments versus basement studios was so perfectly ironic that I almost smiled despite the cruelty of her attack. Victoria was using her residence in my building as the ultimate symbol of her superiority over someone she perceived as beneath her station. She was literally paying me rent while explaining why I would never achieve the kind of success that her lifestyle represented. "What you need to accept, Elena, is that you are exactly where you belong in the natural order of things. You process other people's expenses because you lack the vision to create your own success. You stand in corners at parties because you don't have anything interesting to contribute to meaningful conversations. You live alone because you don't have the personality or accomplishments that would attract a quality partner. Each statement was designed to reinforce Victoria's central thesis that I was fundamentally defective as a human being. That my current circumstances reflected inherent limitations rather than strategic choices. She was systematically attacking every aspect of my life that she could observe, using her assumptions about my personal situation to justify her broader conclusions about my character and potential. The attack on my relationship status was particularly cruel because it targeted an area where I did feel genuinely vulnerable. Building wealth while maintaining anonymity had definitely limited my romantic opportunities, and the secrecy required to protect my business interests had made it difficult to develop the kind of intimate relationships that required complete honesty and transparency. But here's what I find most pathetic about your situation, Victoria continued, apparently determined to push this confrontation beyond any reasonable boundary of social appropriateness. It's not just that you failed to achieve anything meaningful with your life. It's that you seem to have convinced yourself that your failure is actually some kind of noble choice, that your insignificance is evidence of your superior character. The psychological accuracy of this attack was devastating because it identified the exact rationalization that I sometimes used to justify the isolation that my chosen lifestyle had created. There were moments when I did tell myself that my anonymity was evidence of my wisdom rather than my fear, that my avoidance of social recognition demonstrated my authentic commitment to building value rather than seeking validation. Victoria was forcing me to confront the uncomfortable possibility that my strategic invisibility had become a form of psychological defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the risks and vulnerabilities that came with genuine human connection and public achievement. She was suggesting that my entire approach to life was based on fear rather than wisdom, cowardice rather than strategy. You know what successful people understand, Elena, that you apparently don't? Victoria asked, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow student. They understand that value without recognition is worthless, that achievement without acknowledgement is meaningless, that influence without visibility is just another form of powerlessness. The philosophy she was articulating was exactly the opposite of everything I had learned about building sustainable wealth and genuine influence. In my experience, the most powerful people were often those who operated invisibly, who shaped outcomes without claiming credit, who controlled resources without advertising their ownership. Victoria's need for constant recognition actually weakened her position by making her dependent on other people's opinions and reactions. But her attack was effective because it forced me to question whether my preference for anonymity had evolved into something unhealthy, whether my strategic invisibility had become a prison that prevented me from experiencing the full satisfaction of my achievements. She was using my own doubts against me, weaponizing the insecurities that my chosen lifestyle had inevitably created. I mean, look at yourself right now, Victoria said, gesturing toward me with theatrical disdain. Standing there in your discount department store dress, with your bargain basement accessories, your drugstore makeup, your generic everything, trying to blend into the background because you know you don't belong in the same room with people who have actually accomplished something significant. The critique of my appearance was unfair but strategically effective. I had deliberately chosen modest clothing for professional events, partly to maintain my low profile, but also because I genuinely preferred understated elegance to flashy displays of wealth. The dress Victoria was mocking had actually cost more than she probably realized, but its quality was subtle rather than obvious, designed to be appropriate rather than attention-grabbing. The accusation about not belonging in the room was particularly painful because it targeted my deepest fear about the social costs of my chosen anonymity. There were times when I did feel like an outsider at these corporate gatherings, watching other people's confident interactions, while remaining on the periphery of conversations that might have been more engaging if I could have participated as my authentic self. But what makes your situation truly tragic? Victoria continued, her voice carrying the false sympathy that was more cutting than outright hostility, is that you seem to have given up on even trying to improve your circumstances. You've accepted mediocrity so completely that you don't even aspire to anything better anymore. The statement revealed so much about Victoria's understanding of ambition and achievement, but I almost felt sorry for her. She genuinely believed that aspiration was primarily about visible status symbols rather than actual capability or contribution. In her mind, someone who didn't display their wealth or seek social recognition had simply given up on success, rather than chosen a different approach to building it. What Victoria couldn't understand was that my aspirations had already been achieved and surpassed, that my approach to building wealth had proven far more effective than her strategy of maintaining appearances through credit and financial assistance. While she was struggling to afford the lifestyle accessories that created the illusion of success, I was generating passive income that exceeded what most people earned through active employment. The irony was that Victoria's own circumstances provided perfect evidence of why her philosophy was flawed. Her dependence on external validation had led to financial decisions that undermined her actual security, creating a lifestyle that looked impressive but was ultimately unsustainable. She was paying rent she could barely afford to live in a building I owned, criticizing my approach to building wealth while her own strategy led to increasing debt and financial vulnerability. "Elena," Victoria said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone delivering what they believed was helpful advice, "I want you to understand that it's not too late to make different choices. You're still young enough to develop some ambition, to take some risks, to stop hiding behind your excuses, and start building something that actually matters." The offer of guidance was so condescending that several people in our audience actually stepped back, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing such a comprehensive assault on someone's dignity and self-worth. Victoria had moved far beyond inappropriate social behavior into territory that was genuinely cruel and potentially actionable if this had been a workplace interaction, rather than a social gathering. "But that would require admitting that your current approach isn't working," Victoria continued, apparently building towards some climactic statement that would cement her perceived victory. "It would mean acknowledging that you've wasted years of your life convincing yourself that invisibility was a choice, rather than just the natural consequence of having nothing worth showing." The psychological brutality of this statement was breathtaking in its cruelty. Victoria was essentially arguing that my entire adult life had been a waste, that my carefully constructed approach to building wealth and maintaining privacy was evidence of my fundamental inadequacy as a human being. She was attacking not just my current circumstances but my core identity and life philosophy. "And frankly," Victoria said, her voice rising to ensure maximum impact for her final statement, "I don't think you have the courage or capability to make the changes that would be necessary. Some people are just meant to remain in the background, processing other people's achievements while never accomplishing anything meaningful themselves." The finality of this declaration seemed to energize Victoria, as if she had successfully completed a challenging performance that demonstrated her intellectual and social superiority. She stood there with a triumphant expression, clearly expecting some form of acknowledgement or surrender that would confirm her analysis and validate her approach to human interaction. But instead of responding to her attack, I found myself studying Victoria with the same analytical attention I applied to financial reports and market trends. The desperation beneath her confidence was becoming increasingly apparent. The insecurity that drove her need to humiliate others was revealing itself through the very intensity of her assault. Victoria needed this confrontation to validate her own worth, because her lifestyle was built on such shaky foundations that any challenge to her perceived superiority threatened the entire edifice of her self-concept. She was attacking me with such viciousness because she sensed, perhaps unconsciously, that her assumptions about social hierarchies and success might not reflect reality as clearly as she needed them to. The revelation that was about to unfold would demonstrate just how completely Victoria had misunderstood the actual power dynamics in our relationship. The woman she had dismissed as a pathetic nobody was about to become the architect of consequences that would fundamentally reshape her comfortable world. But first, Victoria apparently felt the need to add one final insult that would push this confrontation beyond any possibility of civil resolution. "You know what, Elena?" Victoria said, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had moved beyond concern for social appropriateness. "I actually feel sorry for you. It must be exhausting to wake up every day knowing that you're never going to be anything more than what you are right now, that you'll spend the rest of your life watching other people live the kind of meaningful existence that you're too limited to create for yourself." The psychological cruelty of this statement was so extreme that I could see other guests actively cringing with embarrassment. Victoria had crossed every line of human decency, transforming what had begun as inappropriate social behavior into something that resembled genuine emotional abuse. Margaret Thornton and Susan Walsh were now openly trying to physically remove Victoria from the situation, but she was too committed to her performance to recognize that she needed rescue. The alcohol and self-righteousness had combined to create a feedback loop where each cruel statement seemed to justify the next, building toward a crescendo that would soon cross the final boundary of acceptable behavior. But here's what really bothers me about people like you, Victoria continued, apparently determined to push this confrontation to its absolute breaking point. It's not just that you've chosen mediocrity over achievement. It's that you seem to think your failure somehow makes you morally superior to people who have actually succeeded. The accusation was so perfectly inverted from reality that it revealed the complete projection of Victoria's own psychological patterns onto someone she had systematically misunderstood. She was describing her own dependence on superiority complexes while attributing those patterns to me, criticizing me for the exact mindset that actually characterized her approach to social interaction. "I mean, look at you standing there with that pathetic expression," Victoria said, her voice gaining volume as she built toward what appeared to be her final assault. "Acting like you're somehow above all this, like you're too noble to defend yourself, like your silence is evidence of your dignity, rather than just proof that you don't have anything worthwhile to say." The analysis of my silence was partially accurate, though not for the reasons Victoria imagined. I was remaining quiet because any adequate response would require revealing information about my actual circumstances that I preferred to keep confidential. Defending myself effectively would mean exposing the real estate empire that had been carefully constructed to operate beneath the radar of exactly this kind of social scrutiny. But Victoria's interpretation of my restraint as evidence of weakness was about to prove catastrophically expensive for her. The woman she was attacking as powerless and pathetic was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when someone with genuine influence decided to stop maintaining their anonymity. "You know what I think your real problem is, Elena?" Victoria asked, leaning closer to me with the intimate cruelty of someone delivering a psychological death blow. "I think you're terrified of actually trying to succeed, because failure would force you to admit that you really are as ordinary as you appear to be. Your whole strategy of hiding in the background is just a way of avoiding the risk of being exposed as fundamentally mediocre." The psychological accuracy of this attack was devastating, because it identified fears that I did sometimes experience during moments of self-doubt. There were nights when I wondered whether my preference for anonymity was actually motivated by fear rather than strategy, whether my avoidance of public recognition reflected wisdom or cowardice. Victoria was using my own insecurities as weapons, forcing me to confront uncomfortable questions about my motivations and choices. She was suggesting that my entire approach to life was based on avoiding challenges rather than overcoming them, that my success was meaningless because it remained invisible to the people around me. But what Victoria didn't understand was that her attack was providing me with perfect justification for abandoning the discretion that had protected her from the consequences of her financial decisions and character flaws. By pushing this confrontation beyond any reasonable boundary of human decency, she was eliminating my moral obligation to maintain the anonymity that had shielded her from recognizing her actual circumstances. "And that's why you'll never amount to anything more than what you are right now," Victoria concluded, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering an ultimate verdict. "Because genuine success requires the courage to risk failure, and you've chosen safety over significance at every opportunity." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something shift inside me that was similar to what entrepreneurs describe when they reach the point of commitment that transforms possibility into action. Victoria had just provided me with perfect justification for demonstrating exactly what this supposedly pathetic nobody was capable of when properly motivated. But instead of responding immediately, I took a moment to study Victoria's triumphant expression, noting how her confidence seemed to depend on my continued silence and apparent defeat. She had invested so much energy in this performance that her self-worth now required my acknowledgement of her superiority, my admission that her analysis was accurate, and her conclusions were valid. The psychological dynamics were fascinating because they revealed how completely Victoria's sense of identity depended on external validation and comparative positioning. She needed me to accept her characterization of our relative worth because her own self-concept was too fragile to survive without constant confirmation of her elevated status. What Victoria was about to discover was that some forms of power were most dangerous when they remained invisible until the moment they chose to reveal themselves. The woman she had dismissed as ordinary and powerless was about to become the architect of consequences that would fundamentally reshape every assumption she had made about success, influence, and social hierarchies. But first, Victoria apparently felt the need to add one final insult that would eliminate any possibility of mercy or restraint in my response. Without warning, Victoria's hand moved in a swift arc that connected with my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed across the ballroom. The physical assault was so unexpected and inappropriate that the entire room seemed to freeze in collective shock. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, champagne glasses paused halfway to lips, and the elegant social atmosphere transformed instantly into something tense and dangerous. The slap itself was more shocking than painful, though the force was sufficient to leave a red mark on my face that would be visible for the rest of the evening. But the psychological impact was far more significant than the physical sensation. Victoria had crossed the final line that separated inappropriate social behavior from actual assault, transforming our confrontation from a verbal dispute into something that would have legal as well as personal consequences. That, Victoria said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed she had delivered a perfect concluding statement, is for wasting my time with your pathetic attempt to pretend you're anything more than exactly what you appear to be. The justification for her assault was so divorced from reality that it revealed the complete disconnection between Victoria's self-perception and her actual behavior. In her mind, she had just delivered appropriate consequences to someone who had somehow offended her through the crime of existing in her presence while failing to meet her standards for social worthiness. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the distant sound of music from the main ballroom where other guests continued their evening, unaware that they had just witnessed an act of violence that would fundamentally alter the lives of everyone involved. Margaret Thornton and Susan Walsh stood frozen with horror, clearly recognizing that Victoria had just destroyed her own reputation and potentially her husband's business relationships through a display of behavior that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The other guests who had witnessed the assault were exchanging shocked glances, apparently struggling to process what they had just seen. But I found myself remarkably calm, as if the physical assault had somehow clarified my thinking rather than clouding it with anger or humiliation. Victoria's decision to escalate from verbal abuse to physical violence had eliminated any moral ambiguity about my response. She had just provided me with perfect justification for demonstrating exactly what happened when someone attacked the wrong person at the wrong time. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said quietly, my voice carrying a new quality that seemed to capture everyone's attention despite its softness. "I think you may have just made a very expensive mistake." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive, clearly interpreting my response as an empty threat from someone who lacked the resources or connections to create meaningful consequences. "Oh, Elena, what are you going to do? File a complaint with Human Resources? Sue me for assault with your non-existent legal budget? Report me to the police, who will take one look at our respective circumstances and decide this was just a social misunderstanding?" Each rhetorical question revealed how completely Victoria misunderstood both my actual capabilities and the legal implications of what she had just done. Her assumption that I lacked resources for legal action was particularly ironic, given that I employed one of the city's most prestigious law firms to handle the contracts and regulatory issues associated with my real estate portfolio. "I'm thinking more along the lines of natural consequences," I replied, noting how my calm tone seemed to be creating uncertainty in Victoria's previously confident demeanor. Sometimes the universe has a way of providing appropriate responses to inappropriate behavior. The reference to natural consequences was deliberately ambiguous, designed to plant seeds of uncertainty without revealing the specific mechanisms through which those consequences would manifest. Victoria had no way of knowing that she had just physically assaulted her own landlord, that the woman she had dismissed as powerless actually controlled fundamental aspects of her living situation. Natural consequences, Victoria repeated, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that suggested she was beginning to recognize that my reaction was not following the script she had anticipated. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Instead of answering directly, I reached into my purse and withdrew my phone, noting how the simple gesture seemed to increase the tension in our immediate vicinity. Several guests took unconscious steps backward, apparently sensing that the dynamic between Victoria and me was shifting in ways they didn't fully understand. I think I should probably document this incident, I said, activating my phone's camera function and taking several photos of the red mark Victoria's slap had left on my cheek. Physical assault at corporate events tends to create liability issues that human resources departments take very seriously. The mention of liability seemed to penetrate Victoria's alcohol-influenced confidence for the first time, and I could see her beginning to calculate the potential professional consequences of her behavior. Richard Blackwood's marketing firm depended on maintaining positive relationships with clients and partners who valued professionalism and appropriate conduct. You wouldn't dare, Victoria said, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. Richard has too many important relationships for you to damage his business over a minor social disagreement. The characterization of physical assault as a minor social disagreement revealed so much about Victoria's distorted perspective that I almost felt sorry for her. She genuinely seemed to believe that her social position provided immunity from the normal consequences of violent behavior, that her husband's business success somehow exempted her from accountability for criminal actions. I'm sure Mr. Blackwood's business relationships are quite valuable, I agreed, noting how Victoria seemed to relax slightly at what she interpreted as acknowledgement of her protected status, though I suspect most of his clients would be concerned about being associated with someone whose wife physically assaults employees at professional gatherings. The reference to employees was deliberate, designed to remind Victoria that she had just committed assault against someone who worked for her husband's company. The legal implications of the power imbalance made her actions even more serious than they would have been in a purely social context. Margaret Thornton finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Victoria, I really think you need to apologize and try to resolve this situation before it gets any worse. But Victoria was too invested in her performance to recognize that she needed rescue, too committed to her narrative of superiority to acknowledge that she might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. Apologize? Margaret, I'm not going to apologize for responding appropriately to someone who is clearly trying to waste my time with delusional pretensions about her own importance. The refusal to apologize eliminated any possibility that this situation could be resolved through private negotiation or social pressure. Victoria was doubling down on her position, apparently convinced that her social status provided sufficient protection from the consequences of her actions. I see, I said, making additional notes on my phone while Victoria watched with growing unease. So you're confirming that the assault was intentional and that you believe it was justified based on your assessment of my social worthiness. The legal language I was using seemed to penetrate Victoria's confidence more effectively than emotional appeals or social pressure. For the first time since the confrontation began, she appeared to be considering the possibility that her actions might have consequences that extended beyond immediate social dynamics. I didn't assault anyone, Victoria said, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. I simply provided appropriate feedback to someone who was clearly confused about her place in the social order. The continued refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of her actions was actually helpful for my purposes, as it would make any legal proceedings more straightforward and any professional consequences more justifiable. Victoria was creating a documented pattern of behavior that would be difficult to defend or rationalize in any formal setting. Well, I said, closing my phone and returning it to my purse with deliberate care. I suppose we'll see how appropriate your feedback turns out to be. Sometimes these situations resolve themselves in unexpected ways. The ambiguity of my response seemed to create more anxiety than a specific threat would have, and I could see Victoria beginning to recognize that something about this interaction was not following the pattern she had anticipated. Her confidence was starting to crack as she realized that her victim was not responding with the defeat and humiliation she had expected. What exactly do you think you're going to do? Victoria asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern for the first time since our confrontation began. "You're nobody special, Elena. You don't have connections or resources or influence that could create any meaningful problems for me or my husband." The statement revealed the core assumption that had driven Victoria's behavior throughout the evening, her absolute conviction that social hierarchies were fixed and transparent, that power and influence were always visible and obvious, that someone in my apparent position could never pose a genuine threat to someone in hers. What Victoria was about to discover was that some of the most dangerous people were those who operated invisibly until they chose to reveal themselves. The woman she had dismissed as powerless was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when someone with genuine influence decided to stop maintaining their anonymity. But instead of explaining or threatening, I simply smiled, the kind of serene expression that I had perfected during years of high-stakes business negotiations. "I think you'll find out soon enough, Mrs. Blackwood. Some lessons are more effective when they unfold naturally, rather than being explained in advance." The promise of consequences without specific details seemed to unnerve Victoria more than direct threats would have, and I could see her beginning to question whether she had accurately assessed the risks of her behavior. For the first time since our confrontation began, she appeared to be considering the possibility that she might have made a serious mistake. As I turned to leave the ballroom, I could hear Victoria demanding explanations from Margaret and Susan, apparently seeking reassurance that her analysis of our relative positions was accurate, and that my calm response was just another form of powerless bluffing. But the uncertainty in her voice suggested that some part of her was beginning to recognize that she might have underestimated exactly who she had chosen to attack. The next phase of Victoria's education would begin first thing Monday morning, though she had no way of knowing that her lease renewal notification was scheduled to arrive by certified mail within hours of the business day's opening. The woman who had used her penthouse apartment as evidence of her superiority was about to discover exactly who controlled that symbol of her success. I left the Grand Meridian Hotel with my cheek still stinging from Victoria's assault, but my mind was already focused on the systematic consequences that would soon transform her comfortable world into something far more precarious and uncertain. Sometimes the most important education came from teachers who didn't realize what they were about to learn, and Victoria Blackwood was about to receive the most expensive lesson of her life. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the city feel alive with possibility. I sat in my home office, watching the sun cast golden light across the hardwood floors of my converted loft, while reviewing the carefully orchestrated sequence of events that would begin unfolding within the hour. My phone displayed multiple calendar notifications, each representing another step in what I had privately begun calling Victoria's comprehensive education program. At precisely 9:15, my property management company would deliver the lease renewal notice to Victoria's penthouse apartment via certified mail. The document, prepared by my legal team over the weekend, contained terms that would fundamentally alter her understanding of her housing situation while remaining completely within the bounds of applicable tenant protection laws. Harper Martinez, my director of property operations, had worked through Saturday and Sunday to ensure every detail was perfectly executed. Harper possessed the kind of meticulous attention to legal requirements and strategic timing that made complex real estate operations appear effortless, while actually requiring extraordinary coordination and planning. The delivery confirmation should arrive by 9:20, Harper reported during our early morning call. The rental increase notification follows all municipal guidelines for lease renewal terms, and the building improvement schedule has been approved by the appropriate regulatory agencies. The rental increase was substantial but legal, reflecting current market rates for luxury penthouse apartments in buildings with comparable amenities and locations. Victoria's current rent of $18,000 per month would increase to $28,000, bringing her payments in line with what similar properties commanded throughout the metropolitan area. But the financial adjustment was only one component of a comprehensive reassessment of Victoria's tenancy that would address multiple aspects of her residence at Avalon Towers. The building improvement schedule included lobby renovations, hallway upgrades, and common area enhancements that would create months of construction noise and inconvenience specifically on the floors surrounding the penthouse level. The construction timeline begins Wednesday morning, Harper continued, with lobby demolition scheduled during peak commuting hours. The hallway carpet replacement on floors 15 through 20 will require temporary elevator restrictions that should significantly impact penthouse access. Each element had been carefully designed to remain within legal boundaries, while creating maximum disruption to Victoria's comfortable lifestyle. The improvements were genuine enhancements that would increase property values and attract quality tenants, but the timing and sequencing had been specifically arranged to coincide with Victoria's lease renewal period. "What about the parking situation?" I asked, reviewing the comprehensive plan that would affect every aspect of Victoria's daily routine. "Reserved parking spaces are being converted to visitor spots during the construction period," Harper replied with satisfaction. "Penthouse residents will need to use street parking or commercial lots approximately 4 blocks away. The building's concierge services will also be suspended while we upgrade the lobby systems." The parking issue was particularly significant because Victoria drove a luxury sedan that she treated like a prized possession, spending considerable time and money maintaining its appearance and performance. Being forced to park on city streets would expose the vehicle to weather, vandalism, and parking enforcement issues that would create daily stress and potential financial costs. At 9:45, my phone buzzed with a text message from the building's front desk staff. "Lease renewal documents delivered and signed for by resident. Significant agitation observed during review of terms." I smiled, imagining Victoria's reaction as she processed the financial implications of her new lease agreement. The woman who had dismissed me as powerless was discovering that her housing costs were about to increase by 55%, forcing immediate adjustments to a budget that was already strained beyond reasonable limits. But the rental increase was only the beginning of Victoria's education about the real distribution of power in her carefully constructed world. Over the next several hours, she would receive additional notifications that would systematically dismantle her assumptions about security, status, and social positioning. At 10:30, Harper called with an update that brought genuine satisfaction to what had been an already productive morning. Victoria Blackwood just contacted the property management office requesting a meeting to discuss the lease renewal terms. She sounded extremely agitated and mentioned something about this being unacceptable timing given her family's current financial commitments. The reference to financial commitments was revealing because it confirmed my assessment of Victoria's actual economic circumstances. Someone with genuine wealth would have been annoyed by unexpected housing costs, but wouldn't have described them as creating timing problems related to other financial obligations. "What did you tell her?" I asked, curious about how Harper had handled the initial contact from someone who had no idea she was speaking to an employee of her own landlord. I explained that lease renewal terms are determined by market analysis and property valuation assessments conducted by independent consulting firms. She asked to speak with the building's owner, and I informed her that Meridian Holdings maintains strict confidentiality policies regarding ownership information. The request to speak with the owner was exactly what I had anticipated. Victoria's instinctive response to any challenge was to demand access to higher levels of authority, operating under the assumption that her social connections and persuasive abilities could resolve problems through direct negotiation with decision-makers. What Victoria didn't understand was that she had already met the ultimate decision-maker regarding her housing situation, though the encounter had taken place in a ballroom rather than a corporate office. The woman she had physically assaulted while explaining her theories about natural social hierarchies was about to demonstrate exactly how those hierarchies actually functioned in the real world. At 11:15, the second phase of Victoria's education began with a phone call from her husband's office. Richard Blackwood had just received notification that several major clients were reconsidering their contracts with Blackwood and Associates, following reports of unprofessional behavior at Friday's company party. The clients hadn't witnessed Victoria's assault directly, but news of the incident had spread through the business community with the kind of velocity that only truly shocking behavior could generate. Corporate executives who valued professionalism and appropriate conduct were questioning whether they wanted their brands associated with a firm whose leadership couldn't maintain basic standards of civilized behavior at social gatherings. I learned about Richard's situation through my continued employment at Blackwood and Associates, where the office atmosphere had shifted dramatically since Friday evening. Colleagues who had witnessed Victoria's performance were struggling to maintain normal working relationships while processing what they had seen, and rumors about the incident were spreading throughout the company with increasing elaboration and speculation. "Elena," Richard Blackwood said, approaching my cubicle with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal embarrassment. "I need to speak with you privately about what happened at the party." I looked up from my computer screen, noting how Richard's usually confident demeanor had been replaced by something closer to genuine anxiety. The successful marketing executive who commanded respect from clients and employees was clearly struggling to address a situation that threatened both his business and his personal reputation. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," I replied, maintaining the professional courtesy that had characterized our working relationship for the past 3 years. "Would you prefer to use one of the conference rooms?" We settled into the small meeting room adjacent to the accounting department, where Richard spent several minutes organizing his thoughts before beginning what was clearly a difficult conversation. His usual corporate polish had been replaced by something more genuine and vulnerable, as if Friday evening's events had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his personal and professional circumstances. "Elena, I want to start by apologizing for my wife's behavior at the company party," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent the weekend grappling with the implications of Victoria's actions. "What she did was completely inappropriate and unacceptable under any circumstances." The apology was more sincere than I had expected, suggesting that Richard possessed better judgment and character than his wife's behavior might have indicated. But the professional consequences of Victoria's assault were already spreading beyond what personal apologies could address, and Richard was beginning to understand that the damage might be irreversible. "I appreciate your acknowledgement of the situation," I replied carefully, aware that anything I said would likely be analyzed and remembered as this crisis continued to unfold. Though I think the more significant issue is how Friday's incident reflects on the company's culture and professional standards. Richard nodded grimly, clearly recognizing that I had identified the core problem that was driving client concerns and employee uncertainty. "That's exactly what I'm worried about. Several major accounts have already expressed concerns about continuing their relationships with us, and I'm hearing that other clients are conducting internal reviews of their vendor partnerships." The financial implications were more serious than I had anticipated, though they represented natural consequences of Victoria's decision to assault an employee at a professional gathering. Corporate clients who invested millions in marketing campaigns wanted assurance that their vendors maintained appropriate standards of conduct and professionalism. "What can I do to help resolve this situation?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting genuine willingness to take whatever steps might be necessary to repair the damage his wife had caused. "I know Victoria's behavior was inexcusable, but I'm hoping we can find a way to move forward that protects both your interests and the company's reputation." The request for my assistance in damage control was ironically appropriate, given that I possessed more influence over Victoria's immediate circumstances than Richard could have imagined. But helping Richard address the professional consequences of his wife's behavior would require revealing information about my actual capabilities and resources that I preferred to keep confidential. "I think the most important thing is ensuring that this kind of incident doesn't happen again," I said diplomatically. "Corporate culture starts with leadership, and clients need confidence that everyone associated with the company understands appropriate standards of professional conduct." Richard was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering the implications of what I had said. The suggestion that leadership needed to address cultural issues was a polite way of pointing out that Victoria's behavior reflected on his judgment and management capabilities, that clients were questioning whether someone who couldn't control his wife's conduct could be trusted with their business interests. "You're absolutely right," Richard said finally. "I've already had conversations with Victoria about the seriousness of what happened, and I can assure you that she understands the consequences of her actions." The claim that Victoria understood consequences was about to be tested more thoroughly than Richard realized. While he was attempting to address the professional fallout from her assault, Victoria was simultaneously discovering that her personal life was becoming significantly more complicated and expensive than she had ever anticipated. At 12:30, Harper called with an update about Victoria's morning that brought considerable satisfaction to an already productive day. "She's been making calls all morning trying to find alternative housing options. Apparently, the lease renewal terms are beyond what her family can comfortably afford, but she's discovering that comparable apartments in desirable neighborhoods are actually more expensive than our new rates. The housing market research that Victoria was conducting would reveal uncomfortable truths about both her family's financial limitations and the actual value of her current residence. Luxury penthouse apartments were expensive throughout the metropolitan area, and most landlords required financial documentation that would expose the debt and credit issues that undermined Victoria's apparent prosperity. Has she made any progress finding alternatives? I asked, curious about how Victoria was handling the reality of her limited options. 3 buildings have already declined her applications based on debt-to-income ratios, Harper replied with evident satisfaction. 2 others are requiring co-signers or additional security deposits that she apparently can't provide. She's starting to realize that Avalon Towers might be her best available option despite the increased rent. The financial constraints that Victoria was discovering represented the natural consequences of lifestyle choices that prioritized appearances over sustainability. Her family's decision to spend beyond their means on housing, vehicles, clothing, and social activities had created a situation where they were trapped in arrangements they could barely afford and unable to access better alternatives. But Victoria's housing challenges were only one aspect of the comprehensive education she was receiving about the actual distribution of power and influence in her social environment. The afternoon would bring additional revelations that would further undermine her assumptions about security and status. At 2:15, Victoria received notification that her application for increased credit limits on several major credit cards had been denied due to changes in her debt-to-income ratios. The rejections weren't directly related to my actions, but they reflected the financial pressure that her increased housing costs were creating throughout her family's budget. The credit denials would force immediate adjustments to Victoria's lifestyle and spending patterns, eliminating the financial flexibility that had allowed her to maintain appearances despite underlying economic constraints. Without access to additional credit, she would need to either reduce expenses or find new sources of income to cover the gap between her family's earnings and their expenditures. At 3:45, Harper delivered the most satisfying update of the day. Victoria just called requesting a personal meeting with the building's owner to discuss what she described as, quote, special circumstances that might warrant consideration of alternative lease terms. She offered to provide references from influential community members who could vouch for her character and social standing. The offer to provide character references was particularly ironic, given that Victoria's assault of an employee at a professional gathering had become common knowledge throughout her social circle. The influential community members she referenced were likely dealing with their own concerns about being associated with someone whose behavior had attracted negative attention and potential legal liability. "What did you tell her?" I asked, enjoying the image of Victoria attempting to leverage social connections that were actually becoming liabilities as news of her conduct continued to spread. I explained that Meridian Holdings has strict policies regarding lease terms and that special accommodations are only considered in cases involving documented financial hardship or medical emergencies, Harper replied. She became quite agitated and insisted that there must be someone with authority to make exceptions for valuable tenants with strong community connections. The insistence that exceptions should be made for valuable tenants revealed Victoria's continued belief that her social status provided immunity from normal business practices and economic consequences. She genuinely seemed to expect that her perceived importance would override standard policies and financial considerations. But Victoria's most significant education was still ahead of her. The revelation that would completely transform her understanding of power, influence, and social hierarchies was scheduled for 5:30, when I would make a personal appearance at Avalon Towers to address her concerns about the lease renewal terms. At 4:30, I left the Blackwood & Associates office for what would prove to be my final day as a financial analyst, processing other people's achievements. The decision to reveal my identity to Victoria would necessarily end my ability to maintain anonymity in the business community, but her assault had eliminated any moral obligation to protect her from understanding the consequences of her choices. Harper met me in the Avalon Towers lobby. where the construction preparations were already creating the kind of noise and disruption that would make luxury living significantly less comfortable for the foreseeable future. Workers were installing protective barriers around marble surfaces and expensive fixtures that would soon be covered with dust and debris from renovation activities. "She's been calling every hour demanding updates about her request for a meeting," Harper reported as we rode the elevator toward the penthouse level. "Her language has become increasingly inappropriate as her frustration has grown throughout the day." The inappropriate language was consistent with Victoria's pattern of responding to challenges with escalating aggression, rather than strategic problem-solving. Her inability to achieve immediate resolution through demands and social pressure was apparently triggering the same kind of behavior that had led to Friday evening's assault. Any indication that she's recognized the connection between her conduct at the party and her current housing situation? I asked, curious about whether Victoria possessed sufficient self-awareness to understand cause and effect relationships. "None whatsoever," Harper replied with satisfaction. "She seems to view these as completely separate issues, and has actually complained about the unfairness of dealing with multiple stressful situations simultaneously." The failure to recognize connections between her behavior and its consequences was revealing because it suggested that Victoria operated with a fundamentally magical understanding of how the world worked. In her mind, actions and outcomes were separate phenomena that weren't necessarily related through logical cause and effect relationships. We reached the 20th floor at exactly 5:30, and Harper knocked on the door of Penthouse 2A with the professional courtesy that characterized all interactions with Avalon Towers residents. The sound of expensive heels clicking across marble floors indicated that Victoria was approaching the entrance with the kind of determined energy that suggested she was prepared for a confrontational conversation. The door opened to reveal Victoria Blackwood wearing a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, her platinum blonde hair styled with the kind of professional perfection that required significant time and money to maintain. But her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something closer to barely controlled anxiety, and I could see the stress of her deteriorating circumstances in the tight lines around her eyes. "Finally," Victoria said, her voice carrying the impatient authority of someone who expected immediate attention and resolution. "I've been trying to reach someone with actual decision-making authority all day. This lease renewal situation is completely unacceptable and needs to be resolved immediately." Harper maintained her professional composure despite Victoria's aggressive tone. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'd like to introduce you to Elena Vasquez, the owner and president of Meridian Holdings. She's here to personally address your concerns about the lease renewal terms." The introduction created a moment of absolute silence as Victoria processed information that contradicted every assumption she had made about power structures and social hierarchies. Her eyes moved from Harper to me and back again, apparently struggling to reconcile the presence of someone she had dismissed as powerless with the claim that I controlled her housing situation. "That's not possible," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the flat denial of someone confronting information that threatened fundamental beliefs about reality. "Elena works in accounting at my husband's marketing firm. She processes expense reports and updates spreadsheets. She lives in some modest apartment and drives an economy car. She can't possibly own this building." The catalog of assumptions Victoria had made about my circumstances revealed how completely she had misjudged the actual distribution of resources and influence in our relationship. Every detail she mentioned as evidence of my limitations was either incorrect or irrelevant to my actual financial capabilities and business achievements. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said gently, maintaining the same calm tone I had used during Friday evening's confrontation, "I think there may have been some misunderstandings about my background and current circumstances. Would you mind if we came inside to discuss the lease renewal terms and building improvements in a more private setting?" Victoria stepped back mechanically, apparently operating on automatic social responses while her conscious mind struggled to process the implications of what she was learning. The penthouse apartment that had served as the ultimate symbol of her superiority was revealed to be owned by the woman she had physically assaulted for presuming to exist in her presence. The interior of Victoria's apartment reflected the same commitment to luxury appearances that characterized her personal style, with designer furniture, expensive artwork, and premium fixtures that created an environment of obvious wealth and refinement. But knowing the financial strain that maintaining this lifestyle created for her family transformed the impressive display into something closer to an elaborate performance designed to conceal underlying insecurity. "This is some kind of mistake," Victoria said, settling into a leather armchair that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Elena, I don't know what game you're playing here, but pretending to own this building is not going to resolve whatever grievances you might have about Friday evening's incident." The continued refusal to accept information that contradicted her worldview was psychologically interesting but practically irrelevant to the business discussion we needed to have. Victoria's denial of reality wouldn't change the legal documents, financial records, or property ownership registrations that established my control over her housing situation. "I understand this might be surprising," I replied, taking a seat across from Victoria while Harper remained standing near the entrance. "But I can provide documentation of ownership, financial records, and legal filings that establish Meridian Holdings' acquisition of this property from Harrison Webb approximately 18 months ago." The mention of Harrison Webb's name seemed to penetrate Victoria's denial more effectively than abstract claims about ownership, probably because she remembered the transition period when building management had changed and certain policies had been updated. The improvements in maintenance services and tenant amenities that had occurred since my acquisition had been among the factors that made her penthouse residence more attractive and valuable. "Even if that's true," Victoria said, her voice taking on the defensive tone of someone retreating to a secondary position, "it doesn't change the fact that the lease renewal terms are unreasonable, and the construction schedule is designed to create maximum inconvenience for penthouse residents." The accusation that I had deliberately designed the improvements to inconvenience her was accurate, though Victoria had no way of knowing that the timing and sequencing had been specifically arranged in response to her Friday evening assault. The construction noise and access restrictions were natural consequences of necessary building improvements, but their implementation had been strategically coordinated to coincide with her lease renewal period. "The rental increase reflects current market rates for luxury penthouse apartments in comparable buildings," I explained, maintaining the professional courtesy that characterized all legitimate business discussions. "The building improvements are necessary infrastructure updates that will enhance property values and resident satisfaction over the long term." Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter, carrying none of the confident cruelty that had characterized her behavior at Friday's party. "Current market rates. Infrastructure improvements. You're using business language to disguise what's obviously a personal vendetta based on what happened at the company party." The accusation of personal motivation was fair enough, though Victoria seemed to be overlooking the fact that her behavior had provided legitimate business justification for reassessing her tenancy. Landlords had broad discretion regarding lease renewal terms, and tenants who demonstrated poor judgment or inappropriate conduct represented potential liability issues that needed to be addressed through appropriate risk management strategies. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said carefully, "I think it's important to separate personal feelings from business realities. The lease renewal terms are based on market analysis and property valuation assessments that were conducted by independent consulting firms. Your options are to accept the new terms, negotiate alternative arrangements, or seek housing elsewhere." The presentation of clear choices seemed to focus Victoria's attention more effectively than emotional appeals or business explanations. For the first time since Harper's introduction, she appeared to be processing the practical implications of her situation, rather than simply denying information that contradicted her assumptions. "What kind of alternative arrangements?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying a note of desperation that revealed how limited her options actually were. "My family has financial commitments that make the increased rent extremely difficult to manage, and the housing market doesn't offer better alternatives at price points we can afford." The admission of financial constraints was the first honest statement Victoria had made since our conversation began, and it confirmed my assessment of her family's actual economic circumstances. The lifestyle they had been maintaining required spending that consistently exceeded their income, creating a precarious situation where any unexpected expenses could trigger broader financial problems. Alternative arrangements might include extended lease terms with graduated rental increases, modified payment schedules that accommodate seasonal income variations, or adjusted tenant responsibilities that could offset some cost increases, I replied, noting how Victoria's expression shifted to something closer to hope as I outlined potential solutions. But the alternative arrangements I was describing would require Victoria to acknowledge her financial limitations and demonstrate the kind of respectful behavior that could support a productive landlord-tenant relationship. Her willingness to accept help would depend on whether she could overcome the pride and entitlement that had characterized her approach to social interactions. What would be required for those kinds of accommodations? Victoria asked, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who was beginning to understand that her circumstances had fundamentally changed. Primarily, a demonstrated commitment to the kind of respectful professional conduct that maintains positive relationships with building management, other tenants, and the broader community, I replied, allowing the implication to settle before continuing. Tenants who create liability issues or reflect poorly on building reputation require additional oversight and potentially modified lease terms. The reference to liability issues and reputation management was a polite way of addressing Victoria's assault at Friday's party and the broader pattern of entitled behavior that had characterized her interactions with people she perceived as beneath her social station. Her conduct had created genuine business concerns that needed to be addressed regardless of personal feelings or motivations. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the reality that her housing security depended on demonstrating the kind of basic human decency that should have been automatic but had proven beyond her capabilities when she believed herself to be dealing with someone powerless. I understand that Friday evening's incident was inappropriate, Victoria said finally, her voice carrying a note of reluctant acknowledgement rather than genuine remorse. But I was under significant social pressure, and perhaps consumed more alcohol than was advisable. It wasn't representative of my normal character or typical behavior patterns. The partial apology was better than I had expected, though it contained enough qualifications and justifications to suggest that Victoria still didn't fully accept responsibility for her actions. The references to social pressure and alcohol consumption were attempts to minimize her culpability while acknowledging that some form of accountability was necessary. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the incident, I replied carefully, though I think the more important question is whether you're prepared to demonstrate the kind of respectful conduct that would support a positive ongoing relationship. Victoria's expression suggested she was struggling with concepts that challenged her fundamental understanding of social hierarchies and personal relationships. The idea that she might need to treat someone she had previously dismissed as inferior with genuine respect represented a paradigm shift that threatened her entire self-concept. What specifically would that involve? Victoria asked, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who was beginning to understand that her options were extremely limited. Basic human courtesy, professional conduct consistent with normal business relationships, and recognition that building management decisions are based on legitimate business considerations rather than personal preferences, I replied, noting how each requirement seemed to create visible tension in Victoria's posture and expression. The requirements I was outlining were exactly the kind of behavior that most people demonstrated automatically in their professional and social interactions. But for Victoria, who had built her identity around the assumption that her social status exempted her from normal standards of courtesy and respect, these basic expectations represented a fundamental challenge to her worldview. And if I agree to those terms, Victoria said slowly, what lease arrangements would be available? The question suggested that Victoria was beginning to calculate whether swallowing her pride was preferable to facing the financial and social consequences of losing her penthouse apartment. The process of weighing costs and benefits was probably the most rational thinking she had demonstrated since our conversation began. A 3-year lease with annual rental increases capped at 5%, modified payment schedules that accommodate your family's cash flow patterns, and priority consideration for building amenities and services, I replied, outlining terms that were genuinely generous given Victoria's financial circumstances and behavioral history. The offer was more favorable than anything Victoria would be able to negotiate elsewhere, particularly given the credit and income documentation issues that had already resulted in rejection from other luxury buildings. But accepting the arrangements would require acknowledging that her previous assumptions about power and social hierarchies had been completely wrong. Victoria spent nearly 10 minutes reviewing the implications of what I was offering, apparently struggling to reconcile her need for housing security with her resistance to treating someone she had previously dismissed with basic respect. The internal conflict was visible in her expression as pride and practicality competed for dominance in her decision-making process. "I accept the terms," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had been forced to acknowledge uncomfortable realities about their circumstances and limitations. The acceptance was more satisfying than I had anticipated, not because it represented victory in a personal conflict, but because it demonstrated that even someone as entitled and cruel as Victoria could learn appropriate behavior when the consequences of alternative choices became sufficiently clear. "Excellent," I replied, noting how Victoria seemed to relax slightly once the decision had been made. "Harper will prepare the revised lease documents and schedule a signing appointment for later this week. The construction timeline will proceed as planned, but will ensure that any disruptions to penthouse access are minimized wherever possible." The promise to minimize disruptions was a genuine gesture of goodwill, rather than a business necessity, designed to demonstrate that respectful behavior would be reciprocated with considerate treatment. Victoria's willingness to acknowledge her mistakes had earned her more favorable consideration than her conduct had strictly deserved. As Harper and I prepared to leave, Victoria made one final statement that suggested she was beginning to understand the broader implications of what had occurred. "Elena, I realize that I've made some serious errors in judgment, both about your background and about appropriate social behavior. I hope we can move forward with a more positive relationship." The statement represented more genuine accountability than I had expected Victoria to demonstrate, and it suggested that her experience of powerlessness had provided valuable education about empathy and respect. The woman who had physically assaulted someone for the crime of existing in her presence was learning that actions had consequences, and that treating people with dignity was both morally correct and strategically wise. 6 months later, I stood in the completely renovated lobby of Avalon Towers, admiring the marble surfaces and crystal fixtures that had been restored to their original elegance while incorporating modern technology and energy-efficient systems. The construction project had been completed on schedule and under budget, creating a building that was more beautiful and functional than ever before. Victoria had honored the terms of our agreement, demonstrating the kind of respectful conduct that made positive landlord-tenant relationships possible. She still lived in the penthouse apartment, but her interactions with building staff and other residents reflected a newfound understanding of basic courtesy and social responsibility. The financial pressure of her increased rent had forced lifestyle adjustments that were probably beneficial for her family's long-term security, eliminating some of the unsustainable spending patterns that had created unnecessary stress and debt. Victoria had even found part-time work as a social media consultant, using her networking skills and aesthetic sense to help small businesses improve their online presence. Richard Blackwood had successfully addressed the professional consequences of his wife's behavior, implementing company policies that emphasized respect and professionalism while rebuilding relationships with clients who had been concerned about corporate culture. The incident had ultimately strengthened his business by forcing conversations about values and conduct that had improved employee satisfaction and customer confidence. As for me, the decision to reveal my identity to Victoria had led to broader recognition of Meridian Holdings as a significant player in the metropolitan real estate market. The publicity had been generally positive, focusing on my innovative approaches to property management and tenant services, rather than the personal drama that had triggered the revelation. The anonymity that had protected my business operations for so many years was no longer necessary or sustainable, but the transition to public recognition had brought unexpected benefits. Other property owners had approached me about acquisition opportunities, investors had expressed interest in funding expansion projects, and municipal officials had invited my participation in urban development planning committees. The most satisfying outcome was the establishment of the Elena Vasquez Foundation for Economic Empowerment, a charitable organization that provided financial education and small business support to women who wanted to build wealth and independence through entrepreneurship and strategic investment. The foundation's work was funded by profits from my real estate portfolio and had already helped dozens of women develop the skills and confidence necessary to create their own financial security. Victoria had actually become one of the foundation's success stories, using our resources to develop her consulting business and establish more sustainable financial management practices. The woman who had once measured her worth through expensive possessions and social status was learning to find satisfaction in building something meaningful through her own efforts and capabilities. The transformation hadn't been easy for Victoria, and there were moments when her old patterns of entitlement and condescension still surfaced. But the consequences of her previous behavior had provided powerful motivation for change, and the support available through the foundation had given her practical tools for building a more authentic and sustainable approach to success. Standing in the elegant lobby of a building I owned, surrounded by evidence of successful renovation and improvement projects, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. Victoria's cruel assault had forced me to abandon the anonymity that had protected my business interests, but it had also freed me to operate openly as the successful entrepreneur I had become through years of careful planning and strategic investment. Sometimes the most important transformations came from confrontations that forced people to reveal their true characters and capabilities. Victoria's attempt to humiliate someone she perceived as powerless had exposed her own limitations, while demonstrating exactly what happened when cruelty encountered genuine strength and strategic thinking. The lesson she had learned was expensive but valuable, that power wasn't always visible, that assumptions about social hierarchies could be dangerously wrong, and that treating people with respect was both morally correct and practically wise. The woman who had slapped me for daring to exist in her presence had discovered that some people were far more formidable than they appeared, and that underestimating others could lead to consequences that fundamentally changed everything you thought you knew about the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.